The idea of the Innovation Campus in Saldanha Bay has been brewing in our minds for years, and our passion to bring it to life remains unwavering. Our dream is that the Saldanha Bay Innovation Campus is a meeting of hearts and of minds, and collectively creating a better future for the local energy and maritime sectors. Our hope is that it evokes a fresh sense of possibility and inspires us to push beyond our perceived boundaries into the art of the impossible. Thank you again for joining us. We are super excited to share more about what the Innovation Campus have been doing over the past few weeks and months. It really has been, to say the least, a roaring start for 2021. For the listeners, I'm Adinda. Under my portfolio at the Saldanha Bay Industrial Development Zone is the Innovation Campus, one of our key strategic programs to establish a maritime and energy cluster in South Africa. We see it much broader than only a maritime and energy cluster, but really a platform for collaboration between academia, industry, the community, public sector players, and thought leaders, not only in the sector, but also across sectors. Today with me, we have Herman Jonker joining us from DDAT, the Department of Economic Development and Tourism. Hi, Herman. How are you doing this Monday?
Hi, Adinda. Thank you very much. I'm doing well, and thank you for having me.
Brilliant. Can you share a little bit more about who is Herman, what you do, who is DDAT?
Certainly, thank you. I'm a career official, I guess. So I've been with the Department of Economic Development and Tourism in the Western Cape for a good number of years. And my portfolio currently is within a unit that focuses on catalytic projects or catalytic infrastructure. But my specific unit is focused on industrial development and coordinating things around industrial development. So our flagship project is the Industrial Development Zone in Saldanha Bay, and I've been working on that since the inception days of pre-feasibility studies and looking at what makes sense around zones, industrial zones. And before that, I did a little bit of work in competitiveness of specific sectors, where I worked quite a bit on ship repair, rig repair, the boat building industry, and marine-related engineering services.
Sure. Okay, Herman, that's quite a lot. But I'm going to, for our listeners, kind of take a step back. And just before we started the podcast, I loved it when you said, I'm not a rocket scientist, I'm not a philosopher, I'm not a super theoretical economist, but very much an everyday economist. And I'm looking forward to draw those insights from you today on breaking down economics and innovation into just more accessible blocks of information for everyone. So thank you for that. What brings us here today is very much to understand around what is the socioeconomic value that innovation brings. And I think particularly with the hat that you're wearing at DDAT, it would be really interesting to understand through your lens, what is innovation and what's the value thereof? And maybe one question at a time. What's your definition of innovation as a everyday economist?
Yeah, thank you, Adinda. That is, it could be a mouthful. I mean, there are many sophisticated and smart definitions of innovation, but I think generally, and as you say, as a practitioner, as opposed to a specialist or an academic, my view of innovation is that of something that's applied. So the initial idea around innovation obviously is around something new. It's got to be new, it's got to be fresh. It's something that doesn't happen every day and everywhere, and it has to have new value, something that adds value that wasn't reached before. So whether it's an idea or a methodology or even a product, if you're in commerce, I believe it's about making a certain type of progress and not so much necessarily about a technological leap or about an invention. At Apple, I don't think they invented a phone or a mobile phone. However, their inventive approach was that of making it be utilized in a new way on a new platform and creating new areas of value. And I think in the economic or socioeconomic space, we should apply the same principles rather than necessarily trying to invent new big leap forward things. I think it's about changing our path so that it leads towards smarter ways of thinking, smarter ways of applying our craft. And to me, economics is my craft, but I'm a practical, everyday economic practitioner as opposed to an economist. And so that means, how do we do things differently that it gets higher value outcomes? I think that's broadly my definition.
Sure. Thank you, Herman. I really like what you described there, that it's not necessarily a big technological leap that we're looking for. We often think of innovation as this massive transformative thing that will happen overnight, but it really is the incremental change that we can effect on a day-to-day basis of doing things differently and, like you say, more smartly. But the question is then, why do we want to adopt this mindset of innovation? What, through your lens of, I would say, public sector, what benefit does this bring in terms of socioeconomic change?
Thank you, Adinda. The benefits of innovation have been captured globally, and I think the benefits to an economy are the rather obvious desirables of growing the economy, improving and increasing jobs and livelihoods. And so that's what could be achieved if innovation happens well within an economic system. But I think you're 100% onto something here, that it's not necessarily doing some one valuable, fantastic thing different overnight, but rather to change over time. But I really believe that the South African economy is at a position of significant change that's required. And so what I would want to achieve economically through innovation is not necessarily the next big thing, not, the 4IR thing that will take us into the future of technology, but rather that our economic system starts to change its direction. So it's not a minor deviation, otherwise it would just be adaptation. It has to be fairly significant, but I also don't believe that it's a one-step magic bullet solves all type change. So I think we can agree that with COVID having made us look into something quite different on this earth. I mean, our life a year ago was sort of, we hear about this virus thing and we wonder how soon it'll get to our shores. Whereas right now, looking back, we actually know now that we know very little, but we know a lot more than we did last year. However, if you think of such an inflection point, and you look at the South African economy and the Western Cape economy specifically, it's quite clear that our economy is in a cul-de-sac. It's a dead-end road, and if we do what we've been doing, we'll keep getting what we've been getting. And so if the only way to get out of a cul-de-sac is to make quite a drastic turn, you can't just deviate a little bit. And I think innovation is required in order to get our economic system to make that major shift. And it's a shift, in my mind, not a big shift in a significant specific element, but of all the elements and how they work together. I really think that our economy sits with bottlenecks. For example, how people are skilled and educated and getting ready for their participation in the economy. Or, for example, in how small enterprises are formed and nurtured, and the lack of support for small enterprise, and that significantly impacts on the structure of our economy, which we've been left with over a pretty bad, dark period before democracy. And so those structural shifts, I think, needs to start to happen much quicker, and that a lot of innovation is required to get the mix of sectors right, to innovate at a small, medium enterprise level, and to build capacity and capability into the people that participate in our economy. And I think those three shifts around from the sector mix, from primary, secondary, and tertiary, as well as the size of enterprises in our economy, and the amount of skills and education that our human resources or our human capital brings into the economy. And if we're innovative about those three major elements, we can really unblock the blockages and swing the economy around out of the cul-de-sac and make it go in a new direction after these structural shifts. So to me, it's not can the economy perform better, but rather can it change its nature so that it's ready for this VUCA world of ours, right? We all agree things are volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and it's become a lovely catchphrase. But to turn out of a situation like that does not take just a little shift or just a small adjustment. It's a major adjustment. However, it's not an adjustment of one big thing, but rather an adjustment of how those things that we have to our disposal already, how those things come together. So a systematic shift rather than one single jump. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, sure. Herman, absolutely. And maybe even not just a U-turn, but maybe it's thinking more, I almost want to say thinking more four-dimensional, like where we're so stuck in this way or that way, but perhaps we need to get airborne. And let me explain there before you think I've had too much coffee this afternoon, is I'm really reflecting on what you said there, that we need this big systemic change in our economic framework. And more than ever before, COVID has now highlighted that this is not only an economic problem, but we also at the same time need to solve for our environment, and we also need to solve for our society. And it isn't just a linear or a binary problem that we need to solve. And paraphrasing all of that, I think that's where the opportunity currently lies in innovation, is that how do we rethink the economic framework that we have? How do we start to bring in society and environment so that we can, when we measure success at the end of the day, that it's not only about how much money a company has made, but also the benefits to society and the environment and looking after it. If you then take all of these big structural changes that need to take place over the next few weeks, months, year, how do you see distilling that on to the community?
Adinda, I think you're spot on in your summary about taking flight rather than being fixed on Earth. And it is a major leap, but it's not a leap that's caused by one single thing, but it's, to me, rather a change of how the system sits together. And so in that same line of thinking, one could ask, how can our communities benefit from innovation? What's in it for the people that live in Saldanha right now, and how will their future be improved? And as an economist or an economic practitioner, we talk often about growing the economy, developing the economy, and providing better livelihoods to the people in our community. And so better livelihoods would be a direct outcome, but again, applying the same line of thinking as you did when you described flight versus being bound to the earth. The question we're asking shouldn't be what is in it for our community or what are the direct benefits, but rather to say in which ways would those benefits be achieved, or what can we do so that society is enabled to reap those benefits. And apart from taking shifts and structural changes in our economy, I think there need to be shifts and structural changes in our communities and in our society. And to me, it's very important that innovation brings an element of sophistication or complexity into the mix. And on the one hand, it's this idea of creating capability and competency, which can be done by skills training, changing the education system, providing people with the tools and the knowledge and the experience that'll get them ready for a very competitive world and for a very VUCA one at that. But also, in my mind, building sophistication or complexity is a response to VUCA in a way that we can systematically build something into our society, into our community. And society developing practitioners or social practitioners would often talk about integration in communities. And you see that in the spatial landscape planning efforts, but you also see it in the economy. How do we integrate? And integration also in the innovation space is an interesting concept because you can have 3 or 4 highly technological advantageous gadgets or inventions, but if they don't combine to get collective benefit, then they're not performing optimally. So that integration between your cell phone and your laptop and your car audio system, those integration issues are often the ones that are the most difficult and often the ones that provide the highest benefit and the best solutions. And so similarly, in my mind, our societal integration is what can bring major benefits to our communities, and it's going to require real innovation about how we do what we do, rather than just building another industrial estate, getting highly competitive investors in there for them to make money. In the way that I see societal integration, I believe that those town hall conversations, possibly facilitated across societal groups, is a very, very important enabler to make our society ready for innovation. Because innovation can happen in a lab or in a highly well-resourced business innovation center, or in a company like Google. But if our society isn't ready for what that innovation brings, I think that might cause all kinds of things that we don't foresee, and also that we don't want. So creating a platform of complexity, and I guess when one looks at benefits to society, the good thing can be if the benefits of innovation reaches the society, but similarly, a very bad thing can be if innovation is so exclusive that those benefits go to those who make money, or the benefits goes to those who are in a company, and it becomes exclusive rather than inclusive. So we very easily talk about inclusive growth and about sustainable future, but practically our society must be ready to be included or to be enabled, so that when innovation happens and innovation brings benefits, that innovation isn't something that our community and our society is not familiar with. So in this way of integrating the components of our society better and integrating the components of our economic system better, we also create the capacity to absorb innovation and the competency to deal with innovation, and then ultimately to come up with innovation. I believe our continent is so ripe with very, very, very innovative solutions, African solutions for African problems. And the world can easily learn from us. I really hold on to my faith in my continent that what we put together with all our complexity and all our major challenges are world-beating solutions. So innovation to me isn't, again, not this big technological leap. It's the way that things fit together and the way that complexity is handled and managed that'll really give our society an edge. If the IDZ were to be successful, it's not a big investor with a big factory, but rather a healthier society with a much more wholesome outlook.
There's two thoughts there that I would like to explore, and that I really enjoyed what you mentioned. And the one is around really allowing more interfaces with the community. And that is exactly where I see the Saldanha Bay Innovation Campus got such a big role to play. At the end of the day, we want to create that platform that allows access to innovation for anybody. And where previously academia and public sector and the community and industry and the thought leaders all kind of operated separately, now giving them the space to start a collective conversation. And really, I would like to say, joining hearts and minds in the type of challenges that we face as society and need to solve for. I do have a question on the concept or what you mentioned about the need for sophistication and to solve complex problems. I want to bring back the conversation to the maritime and energy cluster in South Africa. Do you maybe have any practical examples where there have been industrial clusters in South Africa that has produced some really innovative solutions or ideas, or any just success stories that top of mind that you can share?
Certainly, thank you. The idea of competitiveness being driven by innovation is not new. It's been around for quite a bit, and I think the default in that line of thinking is normally that the technology frontier has to be pushed out by these very highly skilled, trained professionals and all the professors in universities and labs. What we've seen in the Western Cape, and having worked with some of these subsectors, is that often when the mix is right, the results are fantastic. And I think that's what I was trying to say during my previous answer, this interface with community, bringing community and local solutions into the mix of where we're asking questions about problems is so phenomenally important. And so when we talk about clusters of industry, we talk about a slightly disproportionate representation of market share in a certain geographic area. And a great example in Cape Town is the luxury yacht building or boat building sector. So of middle-size, double-hulled sailing catamarans, South Africa has a good 30-odd% market share. I don't know that there's any other subsector where as a country we have such a major share in production. And so around Cape Town, you have all kinds of strengths and competencies in working with fiberglass, working with wood, sailing on very rough seas, handling heavy weather in the ocean, people who grow up sailing, learn to feel the wind and the water and the waves. And together with that, then go into factories and build things in a highly skilled way. And this sort of cluster of boat building expertise becomes a system of production that isn't organized or orchestrated out of a single place. So similarly in Italy, a lot of the industrial districts in Italy developed over time, and most of what sits in those sort of informal systems of production is trust and relationships and a knowledge of who is good at what, so that in the end, rather than having a linear value chain that starts with an input material, adds a little bit of activity and value to it, and then you end up with an output material, you have, rather than a straight line, you have a whole sphere of influence on that product. In other words, there's specializations that aren't in the direct production line. A good example of that is in New Zealand, a very small town, relatively small town, has a high share of the global hosiery industry. So that's socks and pantyhose and that kind of stuff. And what happens there is that there are universities that have expertise in how socks stretch and contract. And so it's no longer just you take wool and you knit it into something and it becomes a piece of clothing, but it's a round piece of clothing that fits around a foot, which is rather odd. And it has to stretch and contract in a certain way. So it's a very specific expertise that starts to develop in a community, and that tacit knowledge gets carried over from one organization to another. I'm sure in that part of New Zealand, there are lawyers that are very good at writing purchasing contracts between apparel purchasers and the manufacturing industry. Or there might be logistics companies that are particularly good at how to package socks in a lightweight, low volume way to get it across the earth. So that system of production becomes so integrated with each other and so full of competency and innovative that it ends up providing a much better solution to the world rather than competing with each other around low value activities. And so the Cape Town example for the boat builders was exactly the same. There's some very specialized composites material manufacturers. There's some very, very sophisticated sail-making operations, and even sailing yacht masts are manufactured at absolute global spec in Cape Town. And so there's the small community that doesn't have a structure or an organogram, but it has tacit knowledge flowing between organizations, understanding who's good at what, and having a higher order of manufacturing excellence or operating excellence over time. And that same cluster of industry is starting to develop in Saldanha around the IDZ, where engineering companies are tuning their capabilities towards the maritime industry, where steel fabricators are tuning their expertise towards the energy industry. And I'm sure even the lawyers and the logistics companies are getting better at servicing that market very specifically.
To capture the essence of what you've shared, Herman, it is really around establishing a center of excellence and everyone contributing their speciality to the value chain. And I want to even take it a step further, where the result is there not for individual companies starting to compete with each other, but rather clusters or the centers of excellence competing with each other, let's say regionally or globally. By example, and it's actually by chance that somebody shared with me this morning, similar stat on the luxury yacht industry, and that South Africa is actually the second biggest exporter after France. And it's such a brilliant example of the value that a cluster brings. And it shows that as South Africa, we can compete with the best. And who knows, we can always overtake France in the next few years. Now, to keep this discussion real, we like to talk about the benefits and the hypes, but Do you perhaps see any unintended negative impact that innovation can bring to a region or to a community?
Yeah, it's a very topical conversation in the innovation world, and in the more sophisticated conversations about innovation, which I'm not a part of. Like I said, I'm a practitioner and not an academic. There's a lot of talk about regional systems of innovation and how systems of innovation sit together with the systems of the economy. And so typically in Saldanha, it could be that a very small portion of the population could involve in very high technology activities, and that apart from it becoming exclusive, it can also become, it could also degrade some of the value in the area. So the industrial hub around the harbor could become so successful that there's no space for the tourism industry, or the aquaculture industry could become so successful that there's much less space for other value, even natural value, coming out of the likes of the estuary at the bottom of the Langebaan Lagoon. So the possibility of win-lose rather than win-win is rather high when things become very specialized. And I think that's where creating the system where ecosystems thrive on the benefit to other portions of the same system. Similarly, our society would thrive when the benefits are beneficial to all the components of that society. And so a very basic sort of conceptual model of this integration that we've been talking about is a continuum where I guess you start with coordination, which is a very basic form of working together, and it's about arranging stuff so that they don't overlap. Maybe you have a common information platform or an inventory, but from coordination, one has to move towards cooperation. And from arrangement, you then go to agreement. And rather than just eliminating overlap, you're actually working together towards some joint or cumulative efforts or projects. And the next step to me in that continuum from coordination to cooperation then becomes collaboration. And rather than having an arrangement or an agreement, you start talking about partnership, you start to design and plan together, and there's some sort of a shared vision or a synergy starts to be felt. And then the final step in my mind along this continuum is then to go from collaboration to integration. And that's what we're talking about here. This is not just a partnership, it's also trying to create harmony. So not only are we working towards planning and designing together, we're also dependent on the success of each other. So this shared existence, or this symbiosis rather than just synergy, is what an ecosystem is typified by. And sophisticated clusters with the right level of complexity then overcome these potential negative effects like exclusion and like very high property values in one portion of town and not in another, or extreme divisions of income wealth, for example. So inequality and the dire poverty situations that we see all over our country, even more so possibly across our continent, can often be the negative effect of someone else's success. So my earlier answers to your questions were very much around creating the ability to absorb innovation than necessarily a specific innovative idea. In other words, taking innovation as a way of thinking and a way of acting, and making sure that it is shared and that we drive from coordination to cooperation, and from cooperation to collaboration, and from collaboration into full integration. So to me, not only is it exposure and more interface with society, but it's the kind of interface that starts to create trust and starts to make sure that we understand what value accrues to who, and that we agree on that value. So it's not just a vision, it's not just a pretty picture on a wall, it's a well-defined position of what we are moving towards. And when we move towards it, which part of our society will have what type of benefit? And then we become so interdependent that we all drive each other's success rather than each one driving its own. And then we really have innovation. Then we truly innovate on how a society sits together.
Sure. Thank you, Herman. My mind is racing, and I was reading some books over the weekend about economic frameworks and whether it is actually fit for purpose in our current state of being. And there was this one quip that mentioned that our our economic frameworks that is currently still operating stems back from the early 1900s and even as far back as the 1800s. And we need to set a new intention. Otherwise, we're going to end up with the same results. So thank you for that. It's really been insightful. I'm going to try my best to summarize our discussion this afternoon for our listeners. It's almost time on the clock for us to start to wrap up. And I'm a little bit of an engineer at heart, and I wrote down innovation, and the 4 words that just came through the discussion was that innovation needs to be incremental. It's not about big leaps and massive things that happen overnight, but small incremental changes that happens every day. Then it's about inclusivity. It's about bringing innovation to our communities and giving access to platforms where all players can collaborate and start to think about solving things together and not necessarily in silos, and to share that expertise and that knowledge. The next word that I wrote down was integration, and you spoke so vividly around partnership and getting to that collaborative space. And then the last bit, which I've just described, is around setting our intention for innovation, and that it's not only solving for profit, but it's also solving for people, and it's also solving for the planet. I think the greenie in me is also creeping through. But thank you. What's any last thoughts from yourself, just on the discussion?
I think maybe just an encouragement to our companies, our society members, our leaders in the Saldanha Bay area to reach out and to join in. Don't sit there, don't get siloed. And COVID has got us into our own little spaces with an electronic connection to the rest of the world. I would say what it should teach us also is that we can communicate. We can communicate well. So reach out and join in. And then just to say thank you so much to the IDZ, not just for having me, but for driving innovation and for bringing innovation into our community. And I think we can all look forward to not just a better future, but we can look forward to being proud of the way that we tackled it. Thank you, Adinda.
Thank you, Herman. Really appreciate the time that you made for us today. I'm sure you've sparked quite a bit of new thoughts with our listeners, and absolutely, we need everyone to participate and to be part of the discussion on how do we get things going? How do we ignite? Ignite the conversation for innovation and actually start. I think my favorite word as an engineer is actually start implementing all of this. So a big thank you to our listeners this afternoon for whenever you listen to this podcast. I hope it brings about new ideas. I hope it gives maybe a burst of new energy. And as the Saldanha Bay Innovation Campus, we're really looking forward to walk this journey with you. May 2021 be a lot different than 2020. Our next podcast, we're looking to take the discussion to Saldanha, where we actually will start to interview some of the businesses where they can share how they put innovation to task on a day-to-day basis and share some of the insights on how they do that. Once again, thank you for everyone's time, and please do follow us on social media. We're currently at the Saldanha Bay IDZ Twitter page and LinkedIn page. Thank you very much, everyone. Thanks, Herman. Till next time. If you have any thoughts or questions on this episode or any ideas for future podcasts, please send us an email at innovationcampus@sbidz.co.za. Until next time, let's innovate the blue.